Welcome all. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We'll give it just a few seconds for people to hop on. Takes a while for people to get into the Zoom room. We're very happy to have everyone with us this afternoon. And I am Michelle Wagner with NAMI New Hampshire. I work on the First Episode Psychosis Early Serious Mental Illness Initiative. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is Impact of Racism and Trauma on Black Mental Health. Today's presentation is being recorded, and you'll be able to find it on the education page of onwardnh.org. There's also a short survey we're asking folks to complete after today's presentation. You'll receive a follow-up email with links to both the survey and the recording. This is a Zoom webinar. Your camera and microphone are off. The Q&A feature is working, however, so please enter any questions you have there. My colleague, Michelle Watson, and I will work together to get those questions answered. And now I'm going to turn it over to the Executive Director of NAMI New Hampshire, Susan Stearns, who will introduce our guest. Susan?
Thank you, Michelle. Welcome, everyone. Before I introduce Dr. Crawford, I do want to remind you that this Thursday and I'm going to blank on it, at noon, NAMI New Hampshire is really pleased to be offering a Diversity Inclusion Project Showcase in partnership with NAMI Connecticut, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. So please head on over to our website, check that out and register. We really look forward to seeing you there on Thursday. Now, it is my true pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine M. Crawford, Associate Medical Director of NAMI. Dr. Crawford is an adult and child psychiatrist based in Boston and is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine. She completed her adult psychiatry residency as well as child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship training at Massachusetts General Hospital, McLean Hospital. She received her MD from the University of Connecticut and her master's in public health at BU School of Public Health, where she concentrated in social and behavioral science. During residency, she was the recipient of the MGH Laughlin Award and was selected by the American Psychiatric Association as an APA SAMHSA Minority Fellow, which provided her with funding to develop community-based interventions to reduce mental health stigma within the Black community. Dr. Crawford has worked in various outpatient community settings where she has provided psychiatric care to individuals from diverse backgrounds. She has a strong passion for using education as a tool for community outreach and engagement. She has been engaged in numerous community outreach initiatives through the Boys and Girls Club of Boston, NAACP, and NAMI. She has authored multiple book chapters on mental health disparities and sociocultural issues within psychiatry, as well as made appearances on a number of media outlets where she has discussed various topics within mental health and racism. It is truly our pleasure to welcome Dr. Crawford from just over the border. Welcome to NAMI New Hampshire, Dr. Crawford.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for that warm introduction. New Hampshire has a very warm place in my heart, given that I'm from New England and would always love to spend summers and also visit during the autumn months. So I absolutely love New Hampshire. And so when the invitation to speak with you all came up, I automatically said, yes, but of course I love New Hampshire. So thank you so much for having me. So I'm really happy to be able to talk to you about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I know that over the last couple of years, especially starting in 2020, there were a lot of conversations and discussion around racism, around its impact on mental health of people who are from communities of color. And I've been really encouraged by the fact that a group such as NAMI New Hampshire is still motivated and interested in having these conversations about communities of color, about the role that trauma and racism has. And so I'm really encouraged by the fact that there are spaces that remain open for learning and for growth on this subject matter, because when we all lean into this difficult material to better understand how it is that other people live their lives, that's only going to make us good people. That's only going to allow for our communities to be stronger as our communities continue to diversify. And so again, I'm really privileged to have the honor to speak to you all about the impact of racism and trauma on Black mental health. What I'm going to do is I'm going to define the various forms of racism. I know it's a term that's been widely used, but I think it's important for us to all be on the same page as to what it really means. I'm going to describe racially based trauma and its associated symptoms. Hopefully we'll be able to illustrate the impact of various forms of racial trauma on Black people, and I really am looking forward to a Q&A session towards the end. I'll make sure to allow some time for that. So let's get into the definitions. When we're talking about racism, it's really important to know that it is a system, and it's a system of oppression that disadvantages certain racial groups that are designated to be inferior compared to those who are designated as superior. And it's a system that has been present for quite some time. And it's a system that is really based on assigning these sort of categories to people, such that one group is advantaged, the other is disadvantaged, and it's the oppression that allows it for those power differentials to remain in place. And the other thing that's important to know is that it can occur on multiple levels. We see it individually. And so thinking about that one person who may have negative views towards an entire race of people. But also it's important to think about the role that racism plays on our culture, as well as various institutions and systems. So let me go into a little bit more detail about that. As you can see here in this figure, this really just goes to describe and illustrate how all of the different forms of racism interact with each other. So let's start in the middle with the individual acts, right? And you can see on the outside how that is being influenced by the culture and the systems that an individual lives in, right? And so what we're thinking about when it comes to racism on the individual level, so often we think about that one bad apple who said this thing, who did this bad thing towards a person of another racial group. But we also need to reflect on how it is that we as individuals interact with that one individual who's engaged in some racist behavior. Are we holding them accountable? And so we need to think about folks from an individual perspective, both from the level of who is engaging in racist activities, but also how as an individual are you holding other people accountable. Now, thinking about it from a cultural perspective, what are things that really signal to people who are part of the American culture that there are certain beliefs and values and norms that validate whiteness and may invalidate the experience of people of color? An example that I often like to share to illustrate this point is thinking about back in the day when you used to go to a toy store and you were looking for a doll. Now let's think back to the 80s when Cabbage Patch dolls were huge. You know, for a lot of families, when they were trying to look for a doll who was brown skin, it was really hard for a lot of parents to find brown skin dolls. And thinking even about Barbie dolls, you know, as a child going to the store and seeing on the shelf that there are dolls that are blonde hair and blue eyes with fair skin. Maybe they have brown straight hair, and that's sending a message very early on to that child who may be from a different group, a different racial group, that's what the culture values as beautiful, because you don't see dolls who look like you or look like your family members being represented on the shelves. And so we really need to think about what are some of the things that we have that are part of our culture that is sending a message to our young people that their experience as a Black person is not being uplifted or validated, and the experiences of other groups are. Now, let's think about it even from a more institutional or structural level too. And that's thinking about what are some of the policies and practices that are in place that allows for it such that there are certain people, certain groups that continue to be uplifted and validated, included and served. But yet at the same time, these policies and practices make it such that there's a whole nother group that's in an inferior position because these policies and practices are oppressing them and validating their experiences. They are excluding them. So that's what allows for this organized system of oppression to remain in place because of these policies and practices that remain in place that keeps that difference ongoing. Some other definitions that I want to provide you all is prejudice. And so prejudice is thinking about the negative attitudes towards an entire group of people. So that's having anger or fear towards Black people. And when you're around Black people, just it elicits a certain attitude in you. Discrimination now is the behavioral response to prejudice. So those are the negative actions that's associated with having these negative attitudes towards an entire group of people. And then stereotypes are the negative expectations or beliefs of an entire group of people. So having the expectation that Black people aren't as smart as other groups of people, or that they're inherently dangerous, or that they're incompetent, or that they have some kind of character or weakness. And so we need to kind of reflect on some of our prejudice or stereotypes that we have in our minds about certain racial groups, because it's just been so normalized and ingrained in us, just based on the way in which we were brought up, where we live. And so sometimes it's hard to be aware of some of these attitudes, beliefs, and actions that may negatively impact other groups of people. One way to also kind of tie all of this together is to think about racism as prejudice, so having the negative attitudes towards an entire group of people, but also being in a position of power. And having that privilege of being in that position of power to allow it such that you could remain in that position, but continuing to have these negative attitudes towards an entire racial group, and that's racism. And we need to think beyond just, as I mentioned before, racism on the individual level, in which you observe someone who is treating a person of color poorly, or hearing on the news about a hate crime. We could all agree that those are examples of racism, and it's readily observable, and we know what it is. But I argue what is far more dangerous and what has really had a tremendous negative impact on us as a society is what's below the waterline. What we're seeing is really just the tip of the iceberg, but we need to be curious about where all of that is coming from. And what is below the waterline are the things that are difficult to observe. So that's thinking about things such as implicit attitudes or unconscious biases, thinking about some of the institutional policies, and other structural factors. So we really need to be curious about why is it that things are the way that they are, such that a certain group remains disadvantaged. Those are the things that are difficult for us to observe, while at the same time, I'm hopeful that with ongoing discussions about this and people's openness and willingness, that people will be more aware of all of these additional factors. So just tying it all together and how it really is important for us to take a step back and ask ourselves, why is it such that we hear about all of these disparities when it comes to education and people of color dropping out of high school at higher rates, why is it that they're experiencing far worse outcomes with regards to their health and their medical status? Why are they incarcerated at much higher rates than other groups? We need to understand what is driving that. And a lot of it has to do with history and the policies and practices that have taken place over time. So thinking about things that have had an impact on some of these outcomes, such as residential segregation and a history not too long ago, really, in which people had significant difficulty being able to obtain mortgage loans in certain areas, and that resulted in redlining, and that has contributed to the ongoing racially motivated residential segregation that we continue to see. And also thinking about the resources that are available in certain communities and how the lack of resources can have an impact on the educational system within a given place. And so that's why we see some of these inequitable outcomes and these disparities that I described earlier. But when we hear about these disparities and we then kind of are primed by the media, by the environment that we see, to make these associations and these assumptions about people of color, you know, to think, oh, well, they don't know how to take care of themselves, and that's why they always have poor health outcomes, or yeah, they always are living in communities with lots of violence, and, you know, they're always involved in shootings and whatnot. And all of those messages are being reinforced by the structural environment, by what is shared in the media, and all of that has an influence on our unconsciousness. And we make decisions, especially people who are in a position of power, that is being fueled by all of these things that have led to these unconscious biases, these implicit biases, that allows for structural racism to continue. Because all of these things, when you're a person in a position of power and you have these attitudes and beliefs, it will influence the type of policies and practices that you'll put in place. So that was a lot of information, but I do think it's important to have that foundational knowledge to understand how it is that all of these different factors can have an impact on someone, and to know that racism in its many different forms can be traumatic for people of color, and it can be experienced as a trauma, even though it's not listed in the DSM-5 in terms of it being part of the definition of trauma. What I will share with you today is that racism, in fact, is a form of trauma and can present with the same symptoms that we can see in people who've experienced PTSD. So let's go into it a little bit. But first, another definition. And the definition here, and this is another really important one, is the definition of trauma. In simple, plain terms, trauma is an extreme and sudden violent event that is perceived and experienced by an individual as shocking. It's intrusive in nature, it can be emotionally numbing, and it can result in an altered arousal state. So what I mean by that is being on edge, being jumpy, having problems with your sleep. And what is key to note is that violence, it can be psychological and it could be physical. And we need to understand and realize that for the person who experienced trauma, for that individual, that event poses a threat to that individual's sense of self. And so if a person experienced an event and perceived it to be negative, sudden, and uncontrollable, and felt as though their sense of self was being threatened, that is a traumatic event. And it's important for us to note that the subjective experience of that individual is completely valid. And the way in which that person perceived an event, a particular incident, if it was perceived to be as traumatic, that is valid, because we need to keep in mind that the way in which that individual perceived it has been influenced by many, many years of various experiences that date all the way back to childhood, and that have been reinforced by a number of different interactions with a variety of different individuals and systems that have made it such that the trauma continues to repeat itself. And that's why the experience of an event may be perceived differently, given everything they've been through compared to someone else who may not have that same life experience. But we need to make sure to validate it and not invalidate it or minimize it, because that can result in further trauma. So let's go into some details about what is referred to as the race-related stress model. So thinking about what are all the factors that have contributed to a Black person's experiences and the way in which they perceive certain events as they move forward throughout their life. And because I'm a child psychiatrist, we have to talk about kids. A lot of this starts in childhood, and we see it being played out in the educational system, which is an institution, which is a system that everyone has interfaced with at some point in time. What is deeply concerning is that when we're looking at preschool age kids, so that's ages 3 or 4, Black preschoolers make up about 18% of all preschoolers, but for some reason they account for almost 50% of all preschool suspensions. Now, number one, everyone should be shocked to hear that preschools are getting suspended. What? But why is it that nearly half of the preschoolers who are getting suspended happen to be of color, who are most likely engaging in the same behaviors as their non-Black peers who are in the same class? And so to know as young as 3 that you generate more attention from your teachers, that you're more harshly disciplined when compared to other kids, really sets up this message very early on that you stand out. And you'll see a pattern that perhaps maybe you stand out because of the color of your skin. And perhaps that is something that is being reinforced by all of the messages that you're hearing on the radio or on the news. And we see this play out over the course of a Black student's educational career as they go through elementary school, middle school, and high school. We know that Black students are suspended and expelled at a rate that's 3 times greater than white students. As you can see here on the right, this is data from the U.S. Department of Education, in which you could see in the yellow that Black boys and Black girls are receiving out-of-school suspension rates, out-of-school suspensions at higher rates than other ethnic groups. And this is important because we already know that there are disparities that exist with regards to high school dropout rates. And if you are receiving the message throughout your educational career that you're perceived to be dangerous, that you are being punished harsher, that you are attending schools that are staffed by police officers, is sending the message that perhaps I don't belong in the system. My teachers see me as more of a threat. They're not interested in supporting my learning. So why do I want to remain in the system? I'm just going to drop out. And a lot of that is influenced by this experiences that they've had from a very young age. Also in terms of school, and this is going beyond kind of the experiences of children in the school environment, but even thinking about our adults, Another significant stressor that can be perceived as traumatic is experiencing something that's referred to as a microaggression. Even though micro is part of the word here, to the person who experienced that microaggression, it may not be small in scale, but to the person who might have said something or acted in a certain way and did so unintentionally, that might have put down that person of color or might have invalidated that person's experience. When these things happen repeatedly, it can really have a significant impact on one's overall well-being. And so what are some examples of microaggressions, especially in school? So setting lower expectations for students of color with regards to their academic performance. A story that I often like to share is when I was in school, I had dreams of going to medical school, and I was a pretty good student. But the guidance counselors at my school really encouraged people to go to a community college or a state school. And so it was rare for people to want to apply for a private school. But the messages that we were receiving was, oh, keep going to, certainly apply to the community colleges and state schools, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there wasn't really a lot of support or expectation that we would get into private schools. And I went to school that had a lot of students of color. And then when I finally got into college, I was excited about being pre-med, was in a private institution, and I had some difficulty in my general chemistry class, because here I am attending this school in which kids who attended high school previously went to boarding school and paid to go to school, which was a whole new concept to me. And I was really struggling academically, just in one class. Met with the pre-med advisor, and I said, I'm having difficulty in my general chemistry class. Was wondering if you have any words of wisdom or any advice for how I can navigate this. And he said to me, well, I wonder, if another profession would be better suited for you. Maybe another profession, another career in a health-related area. And I'm not sure about you being a doctor. This was the first time that I met him. I only had one low grade, and I was 17 at the time. And so I read between the lines, and the way in which I perceived that interaction was that someone like me, who looked like me, who came from where I came from, wasn't capable of remaining on this journey of being pre-med and ultimately getting into medical school. And that interaction literally set me back about 4 to 5 years, because I wasn't pre-med, and then finally I had to, after I graduated, I took some time off, I had to take all the classes again. But it took me a long time to get over that comment and to finally believe that I was able to pursue a career in medicine. So for that one pre-med advisor, he probably didn't think much of it. He probably thought he was being really supportive. And at the same time, really did have an impact on how I thought about my academic career and the speed at which I got into medical school. Other things that could be considered as a microaggression is failing to learn to pronounce or continuing to mispronounce the names of students after they've corrected you. And even people that you may interact with. There are a number of last names that are complicated to pronounce, but yet there's an expectation that people pronounce them correctly. And there are people from other cultures in which maybe there seems to be less of a appreciation for the special, for the pronunciation of their name. So a great example is Kamala Harris. This was a woman who was running for president of the United States. And it was amazing how many people continue to mispronounce her name when she was all over the TV. It was really something. So those are microaggressions. The other thing that's part of the race-related stress model is thinking more about the collective experience of racism. So belonging to a community of color, or belonging to a particular racial group. And even if you haven't directly experienced racism yourself, everything, all the messages that you're receiving in the media, messages that you're receiving throughout the culture, it gives you the perception that your racial group is being treated negatively or is being portrayed in a negative light. And a great example of that is just thinking about the stereotypical portrayals of Black people in the media. While watching the news, it can oftentimes feel like some of the negative stories or the stories about crime, or just the negative stories in general, seem to feature Black and brown people, but the uplifting, positive, fun, bubbly stories predominantly featured white people. And so it makes you curious about what's influencing some of those decisions in the news stations about what stories to feature, what populations to include in these stories. And we know that back in 2019, only 12% of TV news employees were Black. And so thinking about who's sitting at the table and making these decisions, and who is able to influence what is being actually represented in the news. And another important term is vicarious racism. And especially when we're talking about vicarious racism on children, but this is something that everyone certainly can experience regardless of their age. Now, what is vicarious racism? So that's exposure to racist incidents that occur to other people. So yes, it could be about hearing someone experiencing racism who happens to be a friend of yours, who was part of your family, but it also could be due to hearing about a stranger who might have experienced racism. And the way that we see it played out in children is that it's developmentally appropriate for kids to put themselves in the shoes of a family member, a loved one, and think to themselves, well, if Auntie Susan went through this, then that means that could happen to me too. Is there something wrong with me being brown and people are going to treat me like that because I'm brown? And so we oftentimes see that in our young kids. They naturally imagine themselves in the place of that target, that individual who might have experienced the racist incident. And we've seen this be associated with lower psychological well-being, as well as some social emotional difficulties. And this is just by hearing about someone that they know and don't know or don't know experiencing racism. We see kids experiencing increased anxiety, a heightened sense of danger and vulnerability, as well as it could have an impact on their mood state and they could feel more sad. And there have been some studies that found that caregivers who've experienced racial discrimination are known to, there's an association between those experiences and seeing depressive symptoms in their kids. So this has ripple and downstream effects. Hearing about racism, hearing about the trauma of racism towards Black people doesn't just impact that one individual who experienced it, but many generations, and including kids. So yes, thinking about the kids and thinking about the trauma that they've experienced over these last several years, and even the trauma prior to 2020, but let's just focus on 2020 and since that time. You can imagine as a child who's hearing about people being killed because of the color of their skin or being treated in a poor way because of the way that they look can be very confusing to a kid. They're seeing this on the news, and then they're also hearing about the protests, the Black Lives Matters protests back in 2020, and wondering why is it that people who looked like them were dying and people were against the phrase Black Lives Matters. Now, a kid of this age in this picture is not going on the Black Lives Matters website to read the organization's mission statement. All they know are the words, and they see that these words have generated a lot of anger in people who aren't Black. And to kind of experience and witness that trauma on top of the trauma of losing your sense of normalcy, your ability to go to school, the ability to hang out with your friends and participate in your usual activities because of COVID, and the trauma related to the virus in which you might have lost loved ones to COVID. So a tremendously impactful and challenging time for everyone, but especially for our young children of color. And as a child psychiatrist, what I was seeing in the clinic was truly heartbreaking and just unbelievable in terms of the way in which kids were presenting and the type of symptoms they were experiencing. Even though they might not have experienced the trauma themselves, just by hearing about all of this and kind of experiencing it was challenging. So what are some of the symptoms that people can present with if they've been impacted and traumatized by racism? So they can have what is referred to as intrusive thoughts. So these are unwanted and recurrent thoughts or images of a traumatic event. And so these are things that just pop into your head in the middle of nowhere that can be incredibly distressing and can be a challenge to stop thinking about. I had previously mentioned in the definition of trauma that it can result in an altered arousal state. So folks can have problems with sleep. It's hard for them to be able to focus. They have variable energy. They may feel on edge or jumpy. And then also people can engage in some avoidant behavior, such as avoiding certain people, certain places, certain environments out of concern and fear that is going to trigger some of these unwanted thoughts or negative emotional response. And also sometimes people can have memory gaps in their ability to recall all of the details of the traumatic incident. And we see this even too with racism. And so when people who might have experienced a racial trauma, it could be challenging for them to articulate all the different details. And the person who is hearing the story may think, oh, well, they're being so vague about everything, and therefore it wasn't a big deal. But we need to be mindful of the fact that because that event might have been traumatic, it could have had an impact on their ability to recall the details, and it's not up to us to invalidate that person's experience. And then some mood symptoms, so experiencing anxiety and depression, anger, as well as some physical symptoms that we see, because experiencing a trauma of any kind is very stressful for the body and results in the release of a number of stress hormones that leads to a cascade of different events that just alters your physiology and can lead to an increase in your blood pressure, an increase in your heart rate, as well as an increase in other things and an increase in cortisol. And all of this has been associated with a greater likelihood of developing chronic medical conditions. This can also make you more susceptible to various infectious diseases because it will have a negative impact on your overall immune system and can weaken immunity, which is part of the reason, among many other reasons, that include structural racism, in which communities of color were significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the severity of symptoms in which we saw and the ability to access medical care, among many other things. And so what I tell people is that being Black in America for many is similar to walking around with a sticky suit, in which all of these different life events, these stressful race-related life events, they stick with you. And so someone mispronouncing your name sticks with you, or having someone follow you around in the classroom, being suspended from school early on, being pulled over by police for no good reason at all. All these events, they stick with you, and it's hard to just shake them off. And carrying all of that on your two shoulders can really weigh you down physically and mentally. And we know that it can have a significant toll on one's overall physical and emotional well-being. What we also know is that racism is a form of adversity. And we know that kids who have been exposed to prolonged adversity are known to have significantly negative health outcomes when they enter into adulthood. And so being exposed to this type of stress, this type of adversity, can not only have an impact on that child in the here and now, but also have an impact on their future. And so we call these adverse childhood experiences. And there was a study that was done back in the 90s that was able to discover that being exposed to physical and emotional abuse or neglect or household dysfunction was associated with poor mental and physical outcomes later on in life. But in recent years, there's been appreciation for how community violence as well as racism can have a significant toll. And that can result in toxic stress. And imagine living under these conditions in which you are chronically exposed to adversity. You are chronically exposed to an overactivated stress response system. As I mentioned earlier, racism, that trauma, can result in a cascade of stress hormones being released that are part of the fight or flight response system. But chronically being in that fight or flight state can disrupt healthy brain development. So all of the things that I just articulated can actually alter the architecture of a child's brain and can remain disrupted throughout childhood and into adulthood. And we know that this can have an impact on their ability to learn, can have a significant impact in terms of their cognitive abilities, as well as increase their likelihood for some diseases, as I had mentioned before. And so this figure on the left really just shows how an adverse childhood experience, such as racism, can result in disrupted neurodevelopment that can lead to cognitive impairment, as well as difficulty with emotion regulation and being able to tolerate stress and to be able to self-regulate, to cope, as well as interfere with one's ability to learn a variety of different social skills. And if all of this is disruptive and impaired, your social, your emotional learning, your cognitive function, it can lead to the adoption of various health risk behaviors that can lead to a variety of different problematic behaviors that can increase your likelihood for disability and disease, and unfortunately, early death. So all of this matters. And I really just want to emphasize the point that we are altering the brain structure of young children when they are experiencing racism, when they're hearing about racist incidences. This is the toll that it takes on them. And so what I would see in the clinic or hear about from teachers or from parents is that kids would present with symptoms such as increased bedwetting, or they're more irritable. They could be more clingy. They could have some learning difficulties. They can present as though they have ADHD in some situations, and have a number of physical complaints such as headaches and stomach aches. And it's hard for teachers to see their kids present in this way and to know exactly what is contributing to some of these presentations. And I think it's important for all of us as adults to come from a place of curiosity about what's driving some of these behaviors, rather than looking at the kid and saying, what's wrong with you? Why are you acting this way? The phrase that is out there, or kind of the question that often is suggested, is to kind of think about the question of, well, what happened to you? And it's really important for us to think about what has happened to our children that have made it such that they present in this way, and to address some of those root causes. Now, kind of going towards the conclusion of my talk, I just want to again talk about vicarious trauma and talk about again about the summer of 2020, and just share, personally, during that period of time, as I was watching the news, I was deeply troubled to hear about all of these stories about people who look like family members, who look like adult versions of my kids, who died. Really was upsetting, and the constant reminder of that, the constant reminder of how Black skin is associated with a heightened level of dangerousness and vulnerability, was truly overwhelming for me. And I was experiencing difficulty sleeping, and I couldn't concentrate, and it was hard for me to see people in clinic and to be as responsive to their needs. And that's because I also was experiencing some of the symptoms I had described earlier, that was related to racism, and in particular vicarious racism. And it doesn't go away, right? And so this isn't a new thing. This is part of the Black experience, hearing about these stories on TV, from our family, from our friends. It's just a repeated reminder of how being Black in this country is associated with a number of stressors that can really take a toll on one's body. And there's been studies that have found that, repeated exposure to the media of stressful and violent events, such as what I shared in the earlier slides with some of the pictures of, like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. We know that repeated exposure to these events through social media, on websites, is associated with PTSD symptoms, depression, anxiety, physical complaints, as well as increased alcohol consumption. And the thing about that is, we know when it comes to interactions with the police, there have been lots of studies that have documented that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police compared to whites. And so if that's a statistic that you're reading as a Black person, or it's a statistic that has been reinforced by what it is that you've heard in the news, you can imagine how people would feel on edge naturally when they interact with the police. But going back to this topic of vicarious racism and the trauma related to that, there was a study that was published back in 2018, in which they found that police killings of unarmed Blacks contributed to 55 million more poor mental health days every year for Black Americans. Now, a lot of people are like, what does that even mean? 55 million more poor mental health days, what does that mean? That's nearly as many poor mental health days as associated with a chronic medical condition such as diabetes. So we know that is having an impact. Vicarious racism is having an impact on one's mental health, and the frequency at which that occurs is so high. And a lot of that has to do with the structural racism that may be embedded within the criminal justice system. And so what I know is that oftentimes when it comes to talking about racism, it can feel really uncomfortable. One can think to themselves, what am I supposed to do? I'm just one person, right? But I think what we can all do is to keep in mind that there's a shared sense of responsibility to addressing racism and to dismantle systemic racism. And we can all do our part. And what we can do as human beings is to talk about this. By ignoring it, we're just contributing to the problem. By having open conversations and dialogue about it is important. And it's also important for our kids when we're talking about racism, because that can provide good modeling for them. And that can teach them to also not avoid these difficult conversations, to not adopt a colorblind mentality. And for you to share what your emotional responses were to some of these moments that could be perceived as racially motivated. If you're hearing about it in the news, or if your child is talking about a peer in school who might have been treated differently, to talk about how it felt emotionally to hear about that, and to discuss strategies, effective coping strategies for navigating it. We really need to start talking about this and to provide concrete strategies and tools for our kids to navigate these conversations, to be able to recognize and identify it, and to feel comfortable actually talking about it and addressing it if they happen to see it play out in real time. And then also to consider the possibility of limiting exposure to media for both parents and children, especially as a parent, as a caregiver, if you are negatively impacted by everything that you're hearing about on the news, to appropriately expose yourself to it, especially if it's having a negative impact on your mood and your ability to connect with your kid. So I wanted to make sure that we had some time for questions, but I'm really happy that we were able to talk about this. Again, it's all about just being open and willing to understand all of our roles and what is happening in our society, and to not feel bad about it, but to lean into it and to continue to educate ourselves and to reflect on how it is we may be reinforcing some of this. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford. You are such a powerful speaker, and you've educated and enlightened many of us today. We have some comments coming in to the Q&A. Steve says, thank you for this very informative presentation. You described well how racism leads to poor health outcomes for Black people. My area of focus is suicide prevention. For many years, Black people died by suicide at a lower rate than white people. I've never seen research on why that is, but I always assumed it was because the support system provided by the Black community. Do you have an opinion on that? And he goes on, also in recent years, the rate of suicide of Black people is increasing. Do you have thoughts on why that might be, and what can we do to address it?
So I really appreciate the question, because there's been lots of discussion in the media about the increased rates of suicide among Black people. But I think in terms of the earlier data, why it seemed as though Black people were dying by suicide or engaging in suicidal behavior at lower rates, is I think that there was under recognition of what was actually suicidal behavior or suicidal thoughts. And so being curious about the cause of death, the extent to which a cause of death was investigated, the openness and willingness of the family to disclose whether or not that individual experienced any mental health related challenges. And also, we know that Black people underutilize mental health services, especially when it comes to outpatient therapy, as well as medication management. So I think that there was under recognition and under appreciation for how it is that Black people can also have thoughts of suicide. And I do think that stigma also played a significant role within the Black community to be open and willing to talk about how mental health was impacting them. I think what we're seeing now is this trend in kids. It's scary because we're talking about kids between the ages of 5 to 12. And they are 2 times more likely to die by suicide. Imagine that. They had 5-year-olds in this study. And so what we know is that there's more awareness among everyone, including our pediatrician colleagues, to screen for depression, to screen for suicidal ideation, as well as other mental health concerns. And so I think there's more screening, I think there's more discussion, and I think there's a greater appreciation for how this can impact all communities. And what we're seeing is that the rates of suicide are also going up among Black young girls, Black young women. So like 15 to 24, that's like another demographic in which things are going up. But I think that has to do with the fact that the traumas that I just described in this talk here, we see that's impacting them, right? And when you feel as though your experience is being minimized or invalidated, and you're not getting the supports, and you don't feel comfortable talking to your parents about it, talk to your church community about it, it can really be isolating and unfortunately lead to some negative consequences. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for answering. From Rebecca, my biracial foster son was told by a classmate that he was bad because he was brown. Since then, he has frequently mentioned that he wishes he was white and made very belittling comments about his being brown. He had extreme trauma prior to coming to us as well and has really internalized her comments despite our reassurances, and living with our family, both our home and our extended family is very diverse in regards to race. How would you address this with him?
Yeah, so what he's experiencing is what we refer to as internalized racism. So seeing, especially as a young person, that people who look like you are doing bad things, or their experiences are being invalidated, they're having bad outcomes, they're being viewed as dangerous, and people are saying this all out loud, and seeing this happen around you and to live it firsthand, that what you think about as a child especially is that, okay, people who look like me aren't good. I've been told that being brown isn't good. Therefore, I'm not good. I'm less than. I'm not worthy. And that's what happens. They internalize it and they begin to believe everything that's been said about their racial group, but they believe that's also true about who they are as an individual. And we see that being associated with lower psychological well-being, behavioral dysregulation, because especially as a child, not being able to articulate that. You know, I'm an assistant professor of psychiatry and I could say it, but imagine being an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, you don't understand what that's about. So we see some of these acting out behaviors where they're getting into fights with kids, they may be talking back to teachers, but a lot of that has to deal with the trauma of the internalized racism. Now, what to do about that? What you can do is to start to introduce the possibility or the idea that you're willing and open to talk about how being brown has an impact on the way in which they navigate the world and the way in which they experience that world, and to validate that. And to say, I wonder how you felt when you were told that being brown is bad, right? And to start talking about the feelings and talk about strategies that you all can do together to combat or counteract that thought, right? And so if this is a really young kid, you could say, well, how did that make you feel about being told that being brown isn't good? It made me feel really angry because I don't like this color. I want to get it off, right? Well, I wonder, instead of trying to change your outward appearance, let's talk about ways in which we can kind of deal with when you feel angry inside. What are things that you could do when you're angry? And kind of doing that at a very young age, and then kind of expanding upon that as they get older with all the different nuances having to do with racism. That's one approach.
Thank you. We are at time, but there's one other question.
Okay.
I love that you talked about not avoiding the topic with children. And I wonder, not just Black children, but also
All
white
children.
kids with Black friends.
White kids with white friends too, all kids, because these kids are gonna grow up to be adults who are working with Black coworkers or rooming with a Black roommate in college, right? So
Right.
we need to have these conversations all the time. It shouldn't only be in the context of, let's get you prepared to hang out with Johnny, who's the only Black kid in class. We got to normalize these conversations across the board.
Right. Because racism affects everyone.
Everyone. Yeah,
Right.
that's why it keeps going.
Right. Right. Thank you so very much for being with us today, Dr. Crawford. We
Yeah.
appreciate you joining us. And just a reminder to folks, a recording of today's presentation will be posted on the education page of onwardnh.org. You will receive an email after today, which includes links for the survey, because we'd love to have you fill out the survey. When you do that, you'll get a certificate of attendance if you're looking for that. And we'll have the website link. For questions or comments, please reach out to me, mwagner@namianh.org. We look forward to seeing you next month, Thursday, August 18th at noon, when we're going to cover the differences between 988, rapid response, and 911. Until then, take care. Thank you so much.